Today, we will be holding a joint hearing entitled Disinformation Nation, Social Media's Role in Promoting Extremism and Misinformation.
I'm glad that this committee is looking at all the ways that misinformation and disinformation show up in our country's discourse. There are important challenges here for our society, and we have to decide how we want to handle speech that is legal but harmful, and who should be responsible for what people say. Now, people often say things that aren't verifiably true, but that speak to their lived experiences. And I think we have to be careful restricting that. For example, if someone feels intimidated or discriminated against while voting, I believe that they should be able to share their experience, even if the election overall was fair. Now, I don't think anyone wants a world where you can only say things that private companies judge to be true. It's not possible to catch every piece of harmful content without infringing on people's freedoms in a way that I don't think that we'd be comfortable with as a society. We did our part to secure the integrity of the election. And then, on January 6th, President Trump gave a speech rejecting the results and calling on people to fight. The attack on the Capitol was an outrage. Now, I believe that the former president should be responsible for his words, and that the people who broke the law should be responsible for their actions. And when we feared that he would incite further violence, we suspended the former president's account. Now, many people are concerned that platforms can ban elected leaders. I am too. I don't think that private companies should make so many decisions like this alone. We need an accountable process, which is why we created an independent oversight board that can overrule our decisions. And we need democratically agreed rules for the internet. Now, some people say that the problem is that social networks are polarizing us, but that's not at all clear from the evidence or research. Polarization was rising in America long before social networks were even invented. I believe that the division we see today is primarily the result of a political and media environment that drives Americans apart. And we need to reckon with that if we're going to make progress.
On YouTube, we removed live streams and videos that violated our incitement to violence policies and began issuing strikes to those in violation of our presidential elections policy. We removed apps from the Play Store for inciting violence and stopped ads referencing the 2020 election or the Capitol riots as part of our sensitive events policy.
I'd rather us focus on principles and approaches to address these problems. I'll start with ours. We believe in free expression. We believe in free debate and conversation to find the truth. At the same time, we must balance that with our desire for our service not to be used to sow confusion, division, or destruction. This makes the freedom to moderate content critical to us. So we chose to focus on disinformation leading to offline harm, and 3 categories to start: manipulated media, public health, and civic integrity. Some of you will say we're doing too much in removing free speech rights. Some of you will say we're not doing enough and end up causing more harm. Both points of view are reasonable and worth exploring. Ultimately, we're running a business, and a business wants to grow the number of customers it serves. Enforcing policy is a business decision. If instead we woke up tomorrow and decided to ask the government to tell us what content to take down or leave up, we may end up with a service that couldn't be used to question the government. This is a reality in many countries today and is against the right of an individual.
Asking all 3 of you, if your platform bears some responsibility for disseminating disinformation related to the election and the Stop the Steal movement that led to the attack on the Capitol. Just a yes or no answer.
Chairman, I think our responsibility is to build systems that can help.
Mr. Zuckerberg, I just want a yes or no answer, okay? Yes or no, do you bear some responsibility for what happened?
Congressman, our responsibility is to make sure that we build effective systems to help fight this
gentleman's choice is not to answer the question. Mr. Pichai, yes or no?
We always feel a deep sense of responsibility, but I think we worked hard. This election effort was one of our most substantive efforts.
Is that a yes or a no?
Congressman, it's a complex question.
Okay, we'll move on. Mr. Dorsey.
Yes, but you also have to take into consideration a broader ecosystem. It's not just about the technology platforms we use.
Thank you. If you think the vaccines work, why have your companies allowed accounts that repeatedly offend your vaccine disinformation policies to remain up? I mean, according to report, just 12 accounts on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram account for 65% of all the vaccine disinformation on your platforms. You're exposing tens of millions of users to this every day.
Yes, we do have a policy against allowing
Oh, I know you have a
vaccine
policy, but will
misinformation.
you take the sites down today? You still have 12 people up on your site doing this. Will you take them down?
Congressman, I would need to look at and have our team look at the exact examples to make sure
Look
they
at it
violate the
today
policies,
and
but we
get
have a
back to
policy in
us
place
tomorrow,
for those.
because those still exist. We found them as early as last night.
What specific changes do you support in Section 230?
I would support two specific changes, especially for large platforms. Although I want to call out that I think for smaller platforms, I think we need to be careful about any changes that we make that remove their immunity, because that could hurt competition. So let me just call on these for larger platforms. I think first, platforms should have to issue transparency reports that state the prevalence of content across all different categories of harmful content, everything from child exploitation to terrorism to incitement of violence to intellectual property violations to pornography, whatever the different harms are. The second change that I would propose is creating accountability for the large platforms to have effective systems in place to moderate and remove clearly illegal content. So things like sex trafficking or child exploitation or terrorist content. And I think it would be reasonable to condition immunity for the larger platforms on having a generally effective system in place to moderate clearly illegal types of content.
Mr. Dorsey, do you agree with Mr. Zuckerberg, yes or no? On the changes on 230?
I think the ideas around transparency are good. I think it's going to be very hard to determine what's a large platform and a small platform, and it may incentivize the wrong things.
Let me ask Mr. Zuckerberg, according to a May 2020 Wall Street Journal report, a Facebook researcher concluded that Facebook's own recommendation tools were tied to a significant rise in membership in extremist Facebook groups in Germany. Were you aware of this research showing that 64% of the members in the extremist Facebook groups studied joined because of Facebook's own recommendations tool?
Congressman, this is something that we study because we want to make sure our products
But I'm
improve.
just asking whether you were aware of it. It's a simple question, yes or no. Were you aware of it? That's all I'm asking. Were you aware of this?
Aware at what time? After we studied that?
I just asked if you were aware of it, Mr. Zuckerberg, yes or no. If not, I'm going to assume that the answer is yes. Okay.
Congressman, I've seen the study. It was about a content
so
leading
your
up to the
answer is
German
yes.
election, and we
I
since made
appreciate that. Let me go
changes
to
to
the
the
second
platform.
question, which relates to that. You said yes. Okay. The troubling research I mentioned demonstrates that Facebook was not simply allowing disinformation and extremism to spread, it actively amplified it and spread it. This is my point. Nonetheless, Facebook didn't permanently stop recommending political and civil groups to the United States until after the January 6th insurrection, years after it was made aware of this research. The fact that Facebook's own recommendation system helped populate extremist groups compels us to reevaluate platforms' liabilities. That's why Congress has to act, because you're not bystanders. You're encouraging this stuff.
Do you currently have any limitations on your own kids' use of your products, or how do you think that will change as they get older?
Sure, Congressman. My daughters are 5 and 3, and they don't use our products. Actually, that's not exactly true. My eldest daughter, Max, I let her use Messenger Kids sometimes to message her cousins.
If you're willing to overhaul YouTube's core recommendation engine to correct this, it's serious, it's dangerous. What more can I say about it? Yes or no?
Congresswoman, if I may explain, we have
No, I don't
undertaken.
have time to explain. So are you willing to redesign your products to eliminate your focus on addicting users to your platforms at all costs? Yes or no?
Congresswoman, as I said before, the teams that design our
You know
algorithms, and
what?
especially
Let me just say this, and I think it's irritating all of us, and that is that no one seems to know the word yes or the word no. Which one is it? If you don't want to answer, just say I don't want to answer. So yes or no?
Congresswoman, these are nuanced issues. And
Okay, so I'm going to say that's a no.
Well, I think a lot of people have seen this. This article was censored by Twitter when it was originally sent out. This is the New York Post, which is a newspaper that goes back to 1801, founded by Alexander Hamilton. And for weeks, this very credibly sourced article right before an election about Hunter Biden was banned by Twitter.
We made a total mistake with the New York Post. We corrected that within 24 hours. It was not to do with the content. It was to do with a hacked materials policy. We had an incorrect interpretation. We don't write policy according to any particular political leaning. If we find any of it, we route it out. But
So regarding the Washington Post,
we will make mistakes, and our goal is to correct them as quickly as possible. And in that case, we did.
you've seen the conversations on both sides about Section 230, and there's going to be more discussion about it. But you're acting as a publisher. If you're telling a newspaper that they've got to delete something in order for them to be able to participate in your account, I mean, don't you recognize that you're no longer hosting a town square? You're acting as a publisher when you do that.
It was literally just a process error. This was not against them in any particular way. We require, if we remove a violation, we require people to correct it. We change that based on they're not wanting to delete that tweet, which I completely agree with. I see it, but it is something we learn.
Mr. Zuckerberg, I'll start with you, and please be brief, yes or no. Would you oppose legislation that would require technology companies to publicly report on workforce diversity at all levels?
Congressman, I don't think so, but I need to understand it in more detail.
Well, we have talked about that, and I hope that if we introduce this legislation, you will not oppose it. What about you, Mr. Dorsey? Would you oppose a law that made workforce diversity reporting a requirement?
No, I wouldn't oppose it. It does come with some complications in that we don't always have all the demographic data for our employees.
Congressman, we were the first company to publish transparency reports. We publish it annually, and so happy to share that with you and take any feedback. But we do today provide in the U.S. Detailed demographic information on our workforce, and we are committed to doing better.
Last week, I testified at a House Judiciary Committee hearing about the rise in discrimination and violence against Asian Americans. Horrifically, that hearing came on the heels of a violent attack in Atlanta that left 8 people, 6 of whom were Asian women, dead. Facebook and Twitter are still allowing hashtags like China virus, Kung flu, and Wuhan virus to spread. Mr. Zuckerberg and Mr. Dorsey, given the clear association between this type of language and racism and violence, why do you still allow these hashtags on your platforms?
We do have policies against hateful conduct, and that includes the trends. So when we see it associated with any hateful conduct, we will take action on it. It's useful to remember that a lot of these hashtags, though, do contain counter speech, and people on the other side of it do own them and show why this is so terrible and why it needs to stop.
The rise in anti-Asian hate is a really big issue and something that I do think that we need to be proactive about. I agree with the comments that Jack made on this. Any on Facebook, any of that context, if it's combined with something that's clearly hateful, we will take that down. It violates the hate speech policy. But one of the nuances that Jack highlighted that we certainly see as well in enforcing hate speech policies is that we need to be clear about when someone is saying something because they're using it in a hateful way versus when they're denouncing it. And this is one of the things that has made it more difficult to operationalize this at scale.
An opportunity to really look at hate speech, what it really means, particularly in this day and age when we have many instances of these things happening.
So yes or no? Do you agree that you make money off of creating an addiction to your platforms, Mr. Zuckerberg?
Congressman, no, I don't agree with that.
Thank
what
you.
we do
Thank
is
you. That's what I needed, a yes or a no, because you do. Mr. Dorsey?
No.
Okay. There's a lot of smugness among you. There's this air of untouchableness in your responses to many of the tough questions that you're being asked. So let me tell you all this. All of these concerns that Chairman Waxman stated in 1994 about big tobacco apply to my concerns about big tech today, about your companies. It is now public knowledge that former Facebook executives have admitted that they use the tobacco industry's playbook for addictive products. And while this is not your first hearing in front of Congress, I can assure you that this hearing marks a new relationship between all of us here today. There will be accountability. I'm going to ask you a yes or no question. And just tell me if you know the difference in these two words. Yes and no.
Yes.
Mr. Zuckerberg, same question for you. Do you know the difference in yes and no?
Yes, Congressman.
And Mr. Dorsey, same question for you. Do you know the difference in two words, yes or no?
Yes.
I'm sorry?
Yes.
Yes, I didn't hear
I know the difference.
You created the Facebook Oversight Board as a way to help hold Facebook accountable. They are currently looking at Facebook's decision to remove President Trump's Facebook account. If the Oversight Board determines that Facebook should have left President Trump's account up, what will you do?
Congressman, we will respect the decision of the Oversight Board, and if they tell us that former President Trump's account should be reinstated, then we will honor that. Congressman, the members of the Oversight Board were selected because of their views on free expression and strong support of it. That's why we created the Oversight Board, to help us defend these principles, and to help us balance the different aspects of human rights, including free expression. But each of the people on the Oversight Board was selected because of a strong commitment to free expression. I think the decisions that the Oversight Board has made so far reflect that.
First, do you agree that many of these decisions that are about matters that so profoundly affect the public interest, should they be made exclusively by private actors like yourselves who have responsibilities for these major enterprises? And secondly, as a way forward to help us resolve these issues or work with them, would you support the creation by Congress of a public agency, one like the Federal Trade Commission or the Securities and Exchange Commission, one that had staff that's expert in policy and technology, it has rulemaking and enforcement authority, to be an ongoing representative of the public to address these emerging issues?
Congressman, I agree with what you're saying, and I've said a number of times that I think that private companies should not be making so many decisions alone that have to balance these complicated social and public equities. And I think that the solution that you're talking about could be very effective and positive for helping out, because what we've seen in different countries is around the world is there are lots of different public equities at stake here: free expression, safety, privacy, competition, and these things trade off against each other. And I think a lot of these questions, and the reason why people get upset at the companies, I don't think it's necessarily because the companies are negligent. I think it's because these are complex trade-offs between these different equities. And if you
pardon my interruption, but I want to go to Mr. Pichai. But thank you, Mr. Zuckerberg.
We definitely think areas where there could be clear legislation informed by the public. I think that definitely is a better approach. I would say the nature of content is so fast changing and so dynamic. You know, we spend a lot of area hiring experts, consult with third parties, and that expertise is needed, I think.
Mr. Dorsey, your view on those two questions, please.
Yes, I don't think the decision should be made by private companies or the government, which is why we're suggesting a protocol approach to help the people make the decisions themselves, have more control themselves.
Mr. Dorsey, Twitter allows advertisers to use demographic targeting to reach people based on location, language, device, age, and gender. In July, your company made changes to your ad targeting policy to advise advertisers to, quote, not wrongfully discriminate against legally protected categories of users, end quote. What did Twitter mean by the phrase wrongfully discriminate? Are some kinds of discriminatory advertising permitted on Twitter? If so, would you please explain?
No, not at all.
I'm sorry, I didn't get that answer.
No, none at all.
Okay, and so can you explain what you meant by wrongfully discriminate?
We mean that you shouldn't just use our ad systems to discriminate.
Oh, okay.
Mr. Zuckerberg and Mr. Dorsey, do you think the law should allow you to be the arbiters of truth as they have under Section 230?
Congressman, I think that it is good to have a law that allows platforms to moderate content. But as I've said today, I think that that we'd benefit from more transparency and accountability.
Mr. Dorsey?
I don't think we should be the arbiters of truth, and I don't think the government should be either.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Dorsey, while I've got you, let me ask you, you've started a new program. It's called the Bird Watch, and it allows people to identify information in tweets that they believe is misleading and to write notes to provide context in an effort to stop misleading information from spreading. Have you seen, we've seen mobs of Twitter users cancel others even when the information they share is accurate. Why do you think Birdwatch is going to work, given the culture that you created on your platform?
Well, it's an experiment. We wanted to experiment with more a crowdsource approach than us going around and doing all this work.
Don't you think that's kind of a dangerous experiment when you're taking off truthful information?
No, it's an alternative. And I think we need to experiment as much as possible to get to the right answers.
From discouraging voting and COVID-19 misinformation to encouraging hate crimes and violence. The harms are real and disproportionate. Do you acknowledge that such content is having especially harmful effects on minority and communities of color? Yes or no again? I don't have a lot of time, so yes or no? Mr. Dorsey?
Yes.
Mr. Pitchow?
Yes.
Mr. Zuckerberg?
Yes, I think that's right. People use our services to share and send messages billions of times a day. And it would be impossible for us to scan or understand everything that was going on. And I don't think that our society would want us to take the steps that would be necessary to monitor every single thing. I think that we would think that would infringe on our freedoms. So broadly, I think it's impossible to ask companies to take responsibility for every single piece of content that someone posts. And that, I think, is the wisdom of 230. At the same time, I do think that we should expect large platforms to have effective systems for being able to handle, broadly speaking, categories of content that are clearly illegal. So we've talked today about child exploitation and opioids and sex trafficking and things like that. And I think it's reasonable that to expect that companies have systems that are broadly effective, even if they're not going to be exactly perfect, and there are still going to be some pieces of content that inevitably get through, just like no police department in a city is going to be able to eliminate all crime.
Mr. Dorsey, did you personally decide to ban President Trump from your platform?
We have a process that we go through to get there, and that came after a warning.
And did you make the final decision?
Ultimately, I have final responsibility.
Twitter denied the Center for Immigration Studies the ability to promote 4 tweets that contained the phrases illegal alien and criminal alien, even though those are the correct legal terms. Mr. Dorsey, if there is a warning posted related to a border threat, how will Twitter algorithms react to the use of the word illegal versus undocumented?
Well, it's not about our algorithms. It's interpretation against our policy and if there's violations. But we can follow up with you on how we'd handle situations like that.
More than 95% of the hate speech that we take down is done by an AI and not by a person. And I think it's 98 or 99% of the terrorist content that we take down is identified by an AI and not a person.
Why is the Chinese Communist Party allowed to continue the use of your platform after pushing propaganda to cover up human rights abuses against Muslims in northern China? And 2, why does the supreme leader of Iran still have a platform to make threats against Israel and America?
We are reviewing our world leaders policy. We're actually taking public comment review right now. So we're enabling anyone to give us feedback.
Mr. Dorsey, what is winning, yes or no, on your Twitter account poll?
Yes.
Your multitasking skills are quite impressive.
Are you aware that Facebook has repeatedly flagged the transgender flag as hate speech and that trans positive content ends up being taken down, while transphobic content like Representative Green's video is not taken down and is often shared widely? Yes or no?
Congresswoman, I'm not aware of that specifically, but this is an instance of a broader challenge in identifying hate speech, which is that there's often a very nuanced difference between someone saying something that's racist versus saying something to denounce something that someone else said that was racist. And we need to build systems that handle this content in more than 150 languages around the world, and we need to do it quickly. And unfortunately, there are some mistakes in trying to do this quickly and effectively.
Would a federal standard for defining a domestic terror organization similar to FTOs help your platforms better track and remove harmful content from your sites?
Congresswoman, I'm not sure. I think in domestically, we do classify a number of white supremacist organizations and militias and conspiracy networks like QAnon as the same level of problematic as some of these other organizations that are able to take decisive action. I think where this ends up being more complicated is where
I hate to cut you off, but I'm going to run out of time. So your answer was, I'm not sure.
You're putting restrictions on conservative speech. Mr. Duncan eloquently pointed out how that is occurring. Angie Craig eloquently pointed out how you're putting restrictions on trans-affirming speech. None of those fall into any of the other categories that you're describing. So to the just to the casual observer, it appears that you're exercising editorial authority, and as such, maybe you should be regulated as a publisher as opposed to simply someone who is indifferent to the content that they're carrying.
Congressman, I think one of the virtues of Section 230 is it allows companies to moderate things like bullying that are not always clearly illegal content, but that I think you and I would probably agree are harmful and bad. So I think it's important that companies have the ability to go beyond what is legally required. I do not think that makes these internet platforms the same thing as a news publisher who is literally writing the content themselves.
Mr. Dorsey, every presidential tweet that I read following the election had an editorial disclaimer appended to it by you. How does that not make you someone who's exercising editorial discretion on the content that you're carrying?
Our goal with our labels was simply to provide connection to other data and provide context.
Just leading up to the election, we had removed hundreds of thousands of videos and we had terminated 8,000 channels. And on the day of the riot, we were successfully able to take down inappropriate live streams. We gave precedence to journalistic organizations covering the event, and that's the content we raised up on YouTube that day. And once the state certified the election on December 8th, we introduced a sensitive events policy, and we did take down videos which were violative. And so we've been monitoring it very closely.
Now, the reason we're here today is because over time, the role of social media has expanded in an extraordinary way, and your power to sway opinions and control narratives is far greater than the US government's power ever has been. Mr. Zuckerberg, since Facebook was my first love, I'm going to direct questions at you, and this isn't a trick question, I promise. Do you believe in the spirit of the First Amendment, free speech, robust debate, basic liberal values?
Yes, absolutely.
See, my colleagues can't infringe on the First Amendment. The American people in their speech are protected from government, as they should be. My colleagues, this administration, they can't silence people they disagree with, no matter how much they want to. But I do think they want to. Just in this hearing, I've heard Democrats complain about misinformation, by which they clearly mean political speech they disagree with. They've complained today that Prager University content is still up. I've heard them accuse conservative veterans of being tinfoil hat-wearing extremists, and that opinions on climate change that they disagree with should be taken down. This is quite different from the Republican complaint that illegal content needs to be addressed. There's a growing number of people in this country that don't believe in the liberal values of free speech and free debate. I promise you, the death of the First Amendment will come when the culture no longer believes in it. When that happens, then it becomes okay to jail or investigate citizens for speech, like has happened in Canada and throughout Europe. Their culture turned against free speech. You all sitting here today as witnesses are part of the culture. You can stand up for the spirit of open debate and free speech, or you can be the enemy of it. Your stance is important because it's clear that many want to weaponize your platforms to get you to do their bidding for them. Mr. Zuckerberg, do you think it's your place to be the judge of what is true when it comes to political opinions?
Congressman, no, I don't believe that we should be the arbiter of truth.
Thank you.
And I want to thank all of you for your patience today. I request unanimous consent to enter the following records, testimony, and other information into the record. An article from Engadget, a letter regarding Spanish language misinformation, data from the Centers for Disease Control.